Good morning, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm very appreciative to both the organizers at the Duke Institute for Reconciliation this summer, and to share this moment and space with you, with Eric, who has been an extraordinary conversation partner. Our topic for this morning is hope and liberation. And one of the first things that occurred to me in my background as somebody who has worked at peace building in a variety of international settings was an experience I had around a dear friend who, in the middle of one of our workshops, sang a song. And to understand this song requires a little bit of background story. And I would prefer to start with that background and then come to the moment when a number of things came together in a very extraordinary way, one morning in Bhaktapur, Nepal. Nepal is a country that I worked in for close to 15 years. I worked there during and after the Civil War, and I worked mostly with a wide range of local community groups engaged in different ways to respond to the conflicts that were happening in their communities, to the violence that they had experienced during the war, and to the very challenging issues of their everyday livelihood being embedded within identity structures that often kept them deeply separated. One of those was a movement that had started roughly in the time period that my work in Nepal began. And this movement was known as the Forest Users Group. In fact, to give it its fullest name, it was the Federation of Community Forestry User Groups. That sounds like a very odd phrase in English, but there is a background to it. And the background was that many people in rural Nepal, which has mountainous regions, has what they call hilly regions, which many of those hills are bigger than our mountains in the United States, and they have the Terai region, which are the vast plains that run proximate to the Indian border. And across all of these areas, many people in local villages and where they have their communities and livelihoods depend on forests for a variety of things that make their livelihoods more manageable. Some of it is for wood that can be culled for wood firing, for cooking. Some of it is about certain kinds of protection of crops and access. And a phenomena began with a very small number of people, probably a dozen or so, who began this community user group with the notion that people most proximate to the forest and the communities that were there could be gathered in a way that they would be responsible for protection of their particular area. And this became known as a local community forest user group. Also, roughly in that time period, there were people who were doing the same around the use of water, especially upstream and downstream people who depended upon channels and waterways. A lot of issues would arise, and they would form these community user groups that would oversee and look for the well-being of both land, water, and forest. So what you have are ways in which local communities were beginning to coalesce around collective responsibility for natural resource use that was directly connected to their livelihoods. Now, this movement started small, but they started with certain principles, and then it grew. And the principles were always very interesting to me. Principle number one was you could not join this movement just by jumping in at a mid-level or high level, of leadership. You needed to be connected, have membership in a local group. You had to have connection to a group that was actually doing this kind of work. And within that context, once a part of that, each group was required to choose 2 people who would be the spokespersons to other groups as they began to grow and actually connect and create their networks. And the principle that took some time to agree to was that at every stage and at every step, that representation of the leadership had to be a woman and a man, half and half, which was unheard of in Nepal. The third principle was that all of the people and the various identity groups, which in Nepal had a lot to do with caste structures, ethnicity, and geographic backgrounds, that those elements, all that diversity, was welcome to be a part of this group, and that local group that was gathering had to find ways to provide dignity and respect for everyone participating. And the fourth element was that as those principles moved, if you will, upwards into connected leadership at higher levels, the same principles applied. Always one man and one woman would be at every level of whatever the tiering of responsibilities from local to national might be. And of course, they had an extraordinary commitment to networking. So they began small, but they began to actually federate. That is, they had replication of these models locally across the country. So this is a movement that began with 12 to 15 people, and today has more than 8 million members, a third of the population of Nepal. So it is about a kind of an extraordinary connection into how something small grows to something bigger. Now, in the midst of this process comes the Civil War, which lasted more than a decade. And many of the communities were devastated. So while in its early inception, part of what was being looked at is how to protect the forest from misuse, or from greed, or from more powerful people wanting to take advantage of the community in one form or another, or from overuse, which is also a big phenomena, especially around forests at this day and age with all of the climate change issues that are coming. Increasingly with the Civil War, local forests and local access to good water were also impacted by people being displaced, whole communities at times due to the fighting and the violence, and in particular in the Terai region, which is along the Indian border and up into what they refer to as the hilly areas. The communities that were most affected were by Mukta Kamaya arrivals. Now, this requires some translation. The Mukta Kamaya is a phrase that's referred to in Nepal for people who have been under, for long periods of time, bonded laborer arrangements. In essence, a form of modern day human slavery. The way that it functioned historically was that the cost of housing, living, and food was more than the salaries that were dispensed at the points of producing work, and in particular harvests and other key moments in a year, such that year after year, people remained indebted to both the system and the particular set of owners that may have oversight for the land and the area and the housing that was offered to these people. There came a moment in Nepal's constitutional history where they made the decision that bonded labor and this form of slavery was no longer acceptable, and that all of these people should be liberated, should be freed. And at that point, which came during the period of, in the latter years of the Civil War, whole populations were now affected both by the unfolding violence and by the fact that they now had access to leaving this bonded laborer situation, but literally no easy next step that could be made. And they often, in leaving, would go close to the places that could provide them overnight with some form of shelter and food, and that meant to the edge of forests and the edge of waterways and rivers. So for a local community forestry group protecting their forest, they could see these people coming as encroachers, people arriving in large numbers, then they were in significant conflict. So part of the task that we had before us in this ongoing relationship was to ask the question, how do people in settings where there are large scale, large numbers of people in conflict over access and use of land, forest, and water, how do they respond more constructively and non-violently to these conflicts? That was our context. We opted for what we referred to as a participatory action research approach. That is, we did not bring in from the outside a preconceived model of what people should do. Rather, we opened a space with the support of a foundation, the McConnell Foundation in Redding, California. We opened a space for participants from across this network of forestry, water, and Mukta Kamaya land representation groups to come together and learn how they might engage differently with the conflicts that were repeating over and again, and with the arrival and availability of weapons were becoming increasingly violent in their expression. So our process was multi-years, and it has unfolded literally for the last 20. And in about the second year of this process, the first year, much of what we did was to create smaller groups who lived in close proximity, where they would go and directly interrogate and look at and investigate what kinds of conflicts were happening in their area. And they would choose one or two of those to begin to actively engage with, to see what was happening, what the past was, and what might be useful for creating some form of dialogue. And they would bring that back to our overall group of about 30 people to look carefully at what we learned, what might be needed, and how we might respond. So we were in a process of learning and learning by doing, with reference to local communities that often varied tremendously in both location and in languages and in cultural context across Nepal. In this particular instance, we had a gathering of about 35 people. And those were typically, if you will, learning workshops that ran for 4 to 5 days, where the groups would gather and begin to share out what it was that they had learned. In that kind of a context, with the heat of where we were located in Bhaktapur, lunchtime was often looked forward to, but it was also a time that soon after lunch people felt a kind of a need for some rest or sleep even. And that would be the moment when we were all coming back, that someone in the group would do some form of an interactive exercise to keep everybody awake and alive in the early afternoon. In this particular day, the person who stood up and led that regathering moment was a good friend of ours whose name was Balu Chowdhury, often referred to as Baluji. Baluji was about 23 years old, and he came from a Mukta Kamaya background. So he was one of the members of this overarching gathering that had come from that community that had been displaced, but that had won its freedom during the constitutional process. His song began in his native Taru with this lilting melody. He had an extraordinary voice. And if you've ever heard South Asian music or Indian and Nepali music, you'll know the melodic capacities that they have. And his voice was soaring. So everyone was gathering and listening to, nobody knew he actually had this kind of musical gift. And he was singing, and as you know, there comes a time where music can actually create deep emotion. And for Balu, in a particular moment, we noticed that something was happening in this song, even though Nepalis included, not all of us could understand his native language that he was singing in. You could feel the emotion when it moved from the melody into a form of guttural sobbing, like he was breaking down. And our whole room went almost dead silent because everyone was watching. Is Balu about to cry and break down? And we wondered what the song was about. And then suddenly he seemed to recuperate and he went back into the melody. But then again he returned to what was sobbing, and his whole body was shaking, and then back to the melody, and then back to the sobbing, and then back to the melody. And then the song drew to a close. And we spent a little time following that, trying to understand what Balu had just sung. And what he described to us was that at age 18, he had been a member in his area, his community, of the Mukta Kamaya that had been liberated. And he said, this song is the song that our community sings to remember the night that we left. Only what we could carry on our shoulders in pouring rain, in the rainy season. Mud was the only trail we could follow out of the area where we had lived for generations, dating back past my great-grandparents. And what this song captures was the powerful feeling of freedom, which is found in the melody, and the absolute despair that we felt as a community of not knowing where we were going, what we would eat, what we would do, and what housing we would find. And so the song, in essence, captured precisely despair and hope in an extraordinary way. Balu became a very significant person in our wider process. So significant that several years into this, his own personal history began to emerge with much greater clarity. Because this was a young man who at 18 and 19, when the community moved and found itself at the edge of a forest, came into conflict with those who were protecting the forest from that existing community. He was the person that the Mukta Kamaya chose to go and talk to the other group, the forest user group, and to explain to them their situation. And the way that he went about that was by finding a capacity to engage with those who wanted them to leave, who considered them enemies, by talking his way into joining their community forest user group, based on the principle that all were welcome. Embedded in that, he became a very treasured member of both the forest user group and the Mukta Kamaya group. And in the process of our work, as these conflicts emerged and as people began to go in smaller groups to engage and find a new way to open up dialogue, Balu was a part of those team efforts. And about the second year in, he came back and raised a question for the whole of our work. And here was his question, which we, from there forward, began to call Balu's dilemma. He said, I'm getting kind of lost in all of this. Because when I go to my Mukta Kamaya community friends, they look at me and they say, Balu, you are one of us. And we want you to go represent us to them. But when I go to my forest user friends, the people I'm also a member of, they say, no, Baluji, you are one of us, and you need to represent us against them. He said, I come back all the time to the same question. Do I do them or do I do them? And at the bottom of it, who am I? Am I a Mukta Kamaya Am I a forest user person? Am I a nothing with no opinion and no idea? Who am I? And in essence, what Baluji was raising was not just a question of who am I, but what kind of leader and what kind of leadership is needed when deeply opposing groups confront. The whole model that they began to develop was a model not based on bringing in outside or neutral or well-prepared professional facilitators or mediators. The model was based on what they called spider groups. In essence, a spider group was making a movement similar to a spider that we could study in how they circulated around the space that they were interested in connecting. And the basis of that circulation was that they were not going after which person represents which group. They were going after a question of how they would go out to each of the groups, and by way of small openings of friendship in a mixed group, a mixed spider group, where each member of the group came from a different part of the community in conflict. And when they would go to the Mukta Kamaya, somebody like Baluji would open the conversation and help that community express the pain and the suffering and the concerns that they have. But when they went to the other group, which might have been from one of the other caste groups or from one of the other ethnic groups, the person in the spider group who was from that group would open up the conversation to help that group express their view. In essence, they were moving to feel and see how each group felt and experienced what had happened in that conflict. And they did that over and over again until some clarity began to emerge for how the whole of that collective could gather. And then that spider group, that movement group, would hold an open air, quite often large numbers of people, sometimes up to 200 or 300 people, gathering across several days to seriously look at how best to address the conflicts that they were experiencing. That model of circulation and what they refer to as the spider group was a model where people from the conflict found the capacity to connect in a very small, improbable set that began to move around that space, opened up ways that they could address conflicts that had simmered in some cases for more than 20 years. As I speak today, just a few weeks ago, I met with some of the members of this group, and they were looking back across the last 20 years, and they have now successfully transformed more than 300 large-scale natural resource conflicts that have been at the edge of violence, if not open use of violence, for years, and many of them for more than a decade or two. Now, this is, I think, a kind of an extraordinary story that relates to our topics. Why look across such diverse contexts as looking from the U.S. to Nepal? Precisely because we are not looking for the direct transfer of how one group did it and then suggest how the other group should do it. But we are looking for what might be called the comparable essences. What sits at the essence that makes something that has not existed and that has been creating suffering and harm and division? What are the essences that bring forward something that permits repair, healing, and even reconciliation? That, I think, is the topic that we're looking at. So to conclude, I'd like to suggest 4 or 5 things that I have noticed from this particular group that I think offer forward ways of looking at the essence that sits at the core. What is the first essence? That we found in those deep principles that were both applied by this work focused on dialogue, but also the forest and water user approaches. And I think that is a deep commitment to dignity. that every person and every community has worth and has experience and has wisdom rising from their experience that can be tapped and understood and brought forward. At essence, dignity means that we are finding ways to humanize the edge and the face of conflict. That standing before us is not the oppositional forces. Standing before us are actually fellow human beings. The second is, I think there's an essence which was their commitment profoundly to dialogue and nonviolence. That their view is that we have not lost our capacity to both listen, to connect, but also that dialogue is possible. That it is possible, even in the worst of conflicts, to work from and with those communities that are in conflict. And I think that leads to a third essence, which was they were committed to collective empathy. Now, I won't say a word about collective empathy. We often think of empathy as being more individuated. Walk a mile in her or his shoes. Here, collective empathy was that a small group was going out to sit where those people sat and see the world from their experience. So circulation was a different approach than convening. Convening is just bringing people together who represent and try to find proper representation for dialogue, separated from the context where people live. Here, what they were doing was they were going out and spending time to see what it felt like, what the experience was. And that began to create much greater possibility of a collective way of expressing what had happened. That wider sets of ears and mouths and feet and hands were part of what was happening as that was approaching. In other words, there was a dignity that came in the form of acknowledgement, of emplacement, of what it was that people had experienced in those places. And I think that that leads then to a fourth principle, that constant circulation began to create a sensation of people feeling accompanied. That is, we could call this a commitment to alongsideness. How do we come alongside the suffering and experience that people have had? Not isolation or demanding representation, but the feeling of the presence of others committed to making sure that your dignity, your voice, and your experience is respected and brought forward. And this, I think, begins to offer forward some of the core planks of what we might call the platforms for reconciliation. Reconciliation, I think, is misunderstood far too often as some kind of an event. That event where a few people suddenly have this meeting and the laying aside of their differences. Actually, what this whole process instructs us about is that reconciliation is not an event, but it's a commitment to a learning journey. And a commitment to a learning journey requires you to go to places that are uncomfortable and take time, and requires you to sit and feel how it is that others have experienced what has happened in our wider collective. Liberation in this sense is not a kind of a once and it's over thing. Liberation, I think, is actually a commitment to the quality of relationships that are required, to the listening to both learn and understand, but also speaks to the commitment of repair. How do we begin to stitch back together that which has been broken, even if we were not directly responsible in our personal process? Our wider context asks us, what does this context require of us? It seeks that repair because it will take time and action to bring together what has been harmed. and it will require the patience to stay alongside. So in a sense, hope in this kind of an instance is not a kind of a far off horizon. Hope in many regards is alongsideness. It is about the embodied accompaniment of choosing to be alongside and taking a step, each of us together, one by one. What can we reach? Who do we know? How do we connect? And how do we stay connected? If we were to answer Balu's dilemma, it was that the challenge of leadership is both to imagine how I stay connected to those people who closely identify with my own personal experience, while at the same time developing a capacity to imagine how do we repair what has harmed the collective good and the individuated good together in a way that permits us to journey together. And this, I think, are the things that I have learned in particular from this group that is now known as the Natural Resource Conflict Transformation Center of Nepal. From the beginning, they said, we are not an NGO, we are a movement. And our movement is about bringing a culture of dignity and dialogue to those places that have been hurt the most in our country. So thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. I regret that I can't be there in person, and I want to wish you all the best.